Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Bliffert Lumber, family-owned and operated for over 120 years. Bliffert serves contractors and homeowners across Milwaukee and southeastern Wisconsin. Learn more at bliffertlumber.com.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Today, we'll tell you about a whistleblower complaint about the management of the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. Then we'll look at the Milwaukee Police Department's use of drones.
Drones are another question we have to wrestle with as Americans dealing with the Fourth Amendment, but they are, in the sense, just a different way of applying a camera, which have been around for however long.
Plus, for the 10-year anniversary of Bubbler Talk, we'll take you behind the scenes to share how we answer your questions about the community.
You have a question, and sometimes you think this is unanswerable. How would I ever? And yet, if you just scratch a little bit, and if you keep scratching and scratching and scratching, eventually you're going to find that full story.
All that's coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Thanks for joining us. The Milwaukee region has two wastewater treatment plants, one on Jones Island just below the 3rd Ward, and the other is further south along Lake Michigan's shore in Oak Creek. The Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District, also known as MMSD, is responsible for those two facilities. Together, they handle wastewater for over 1 million people across 29 municipalities, delivering the treated water back into Lake Michigan. Since 2008, the MMSD has contracted with a company called Veolia to run them. Their 10-year contract with Veolia is up for another 10-year renewal. Meanwhile, advocacy group Common Ground is raising concerns about Veolia's management of the wastewater treatment plants. WUWM environmental reporter Susan Bentz is here to tell us more. Hey, Susan, thanks for joining me.
Great to be with you.
So, Susan, I think lots of people have become definitely more aware of our water management system in light of recent storms and floodings that have overwhelmed the system in recent history. Can you tell us more about how this all works?
You bet. I think you're absolutely right, Audrey. We're all thinking about this in one way or the other. So it's the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District that handles the water that goes down our drains, whether at home or on the street. Stormwater is part of that, and it can stress the system, especially when rains are intense. So years ago, the MMSD constructed a series of deep tunnels. Together, they hold 521 million gallons of water. That's a lot. I mean, the idea is to give the two wastewater treatment plants time to catch up when we experience heavier rain. But even their capacity can't prevent untreated wastewater from periodically being released into Lake Michigan when the system is overwhelmed by massive rain events.
Right. So these deep tunnels is how our wastewater is stored and why sometimes it is released into Lake Michigan before it's treated. So let's talk about the company that MMSD pays to manage these treatment plants, Veolia. Their contract is up for another 10-year renewal. Where does this stand right now?
So you're right. Veolia is a French company, and it's been running the Jones Island and South Shore plants since 2008, and the current contract expires in 2028. Recently, a local nonprofit advocacy group, Common Ground, has raised concern that Veolia is not managing those two facilities properly.
Now, if listeners their ears are perking up at Common Ground, they'd be correct too, because they've been hearing a lot about Common Ground recently. They take on community issues and call for reform. Most recently, our colleagues Jimmy Gutierrez and Sam Woods have been covering Common Ground's campaign against a negligent landlord. So there's a lot of things that Common Ground covers. So tell us about this other issue that Common Ground has now taken up when it comes to wastewater treatment.
Well, when it comes to the wastewater treatment plants, Common Ground was contacted by a whistleblower. His name is Steve Jacart, and he served as MMSD's intergovernmental coordinator from 1994 to 2023. Jacart shared his concerns that Veolia isn't doing that job properly, and he's worrying that issues around the processing of biosolids a decade ago have not been fully tended to. Jacart spoke publicly for the first time April 30th at the War Memorial Hall in downtown Milwaukee. The gathering was hosted by Common Ground.
So this breakdown in biosolids removal and disposal has resulted in reduced wastewater treatment capacity.
So Jacquard alleges MMSD's wastewater treatment plants aren't being maintained to operate at full capacity. He says that means the water being returned to Lake Michigan contains higher levels of bacteria. And when storms strike, there's an increased risk of sewage overflows and basement backups.
The last overflow that we had, it was 2.7 billion gallons. During that storm, South Shore Wastewater Treatment Plant, that's in Oak Creek, was only running at 83% capacity. That was just the peak capacity. It was below that for a lot of that storm. And that's according to the spokesperson for MMSD said that on public radio. What was also reported in the journal Sentinel during that storm is that this overflow lasted 112 hours. That's more than 4.5 days.
So, Susan, what is Jacquard and Common Ground calling for here in this moment?
So one of Common Ground's founders, Bob Connolly, asked fellow members last week at that session to sign a letter calling on MMSD to undertake an independent third-party performance audit of Veolia before it awards the next 10-year contract. Here's Connolly at that public meeting.
We don't know what happens next because we have to wait for the reaction. We have to wait and see whether or not they're going to be reasonable. And the Board of Commissioners have the power and the authority to authorize a performance audit. It's well within their ability, well within their power. We just don't know whether they'll do it yet. We've had conversations with almost all of them. They needed to see what we had. They needed to meet Steve. They needed to hear our testimony before they're going to act. And we don't know how they're going to act. So we're going to leave with a degree of uncertainty, but we're leaving with the knowledge that Common Ground never gives up. We never go away.
So we've heard from Jacquard and Connolly, but what about MMSD? How are MMSD and Veolia responding to these concerns?
Well, I met with MMSD Executive Director Kevin Schaefer this week. He told me he's totally confident, those are his words, that Veolia is properly managing the Jones Island and South Shore wastewater plants. Here's what he said.
The treatment plants are platinum-rated treatment plants as far as national standards. They operate well below the state and federal requirements. And the Milorganite that we put out is a Class A qualified or quality, so it's a good product and it's safe.
And Schaefer wanted to underscore his conviction.
So I have not had a concern that Veolia has caused an additional overflow. I have not had any concerns that what they've done has caused basement backups. What we're seeing is just heavier rains more often, the last 2 years being examples, April of 26 and August of 25. And, everyone's going to have issues when you have that much rain, 15 inches in August and 5 to 7 inches in April.
Veolia sent WUWM this statement about Common Ground's claims. They called it a mix of false, unsubstantiated, and overstated claims about Veolia, which Common Ground admitted during the event they could not verify. That's just part of their statement. We have the full statement on our website.
Okay, excellent. So, did Kevin Schaefer of MMSD seem to be taking Common Ground's concerns seriously?
Well, the district has brought on a Madison-based legal team. Schaefer hopes it will be setting up a meeting with Common Ground.
They've said that there's 15 former Veolia MMSD employees, or active, I don't know who, and we don't want to know who, but we have a law firm that we've never dealt with before out of Madison that's going to meet with Common Ground and try to meet with these 15 individuals because they're asking us to do a performance audit, but we don't know what we're auditing. We don't know what the issues are totally.
Schaefer says MMSD also wants to hear what people think about the next 10-year contract that's under debate. A public meeting will take place Thursday, June 11th at 5:30 p.m.
We were going to have a public meeting at some point. Originally, we had decided to do it as part of one of the ad hoc meetings during the morning, but because of the concerns raised by Common Ground, we decided to do it in the evening just to see if there's more people that want to come to that. So you don't award a $60 to $70 million a year contract and not ask the public for their input. We don't do that.
So what's happening on the Common Ground front?
Well, they're busy. Bob Conley says this week letters signed by 175 Common Ground members are being delivered to the MMSD's 11 commissioners. Those commissioners comprise the independent commission that's tasked with overseeing MMSD. 7 are appointed by Milwaukee's mayor, and the rest are selected by mayors and village presidents of the other municipalities the MMSD serves. In the meantime, Conley says more whistleblowers are coming forward. They're raising concerns about Veolia's management of our wastewater. He's determined to convince the commissioners to take Common Ground's call for an audit seriously. Conley says it's the commissioners' job to establish and enforce district policy.
All right, well, certainly a lot of updates. Thank you for following what's happened so far, Susan, and I know there'll be more to this story, but for today, thanks for joining me on Lake Effect.
You bet. Great to be with you, Audrey.
Susan Bentz is WUWM's environmental reporter. You can find more information about the concerns Common Ground has raised about Veolia's management of MMSD's wastewater treatment plants, as well as Veolia's full statement at WUWM.com. Lake Effect is available as a podcast, so you can listen when you like. Find it wherever you get your podcasts, then subscribe, download, and listen on demand. In about 15 minutes, we'll learn about the Milwaukee Public Library's historic recipe file. But first, we'll look at the Milwaukee Police Department's use of drones and what the benefits and potential pitfalls could be. That's coming up on Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. The Milwaukee Police Department began using drones earlier this year, and police departments around the country are adopting similar strategies. Proponents of the technology note that drones can fly faster and see farther than police officers, making them useful in search and rescue or first responder situations. Critics point to the use of drones for surveillance purposes and the potential to be used with facial recognition technology. Adam Rogan is a freelance journalist who wrote about police drones for this month's Milwaukee magazine. He sat down with Lake Effect's Sam Woods to talk about what the technology can do and the lack of guardrails around it.
Can you start by giving an overview of what this technology is and what we know about its use?
Of course. So the Milwaukee Police Department and local law enforcement for the first time used the remote control drones above Milwaukee during the Republican National Convention for just keeping an eye on crowds, that kind of thing, looking for threats. It's since expanded, and this year they've fully launched what is called the Drones as First Responder program, through which they have, I believe it's 12 drones in the department that can be flown to emergencies. They're used for things, for example, a lost hiker or a swimmer swept out gets caught in a rip current, swept out into the lake. The first use for the Sergeant Boss who leads the program, he shared with me with the first time he ever used one on an actual call was a shooting scene. He was able to, the drone is able to fly itself generally to the area of where a report is made, and then an officer will control it thereafter. And he's able to find the victim before a police officer is able to get to the scene and render aid. And then during that time, he was able to do crowd control, make sure nobody was hiding in the bushes. If he sees somebody running, he can report that to the officers, that sort of thing. And it's been going on since the pilot program end of last year and now in full effect in 2026.
What do we know about the Milwaukee Police's use of drones versus other local governments?
So Milwaukee is kind of on the cutting edge here. A lot of departments will just have one. Milwaukee is really strongly invested in it through a government grant to be able to pay for these drones. Each one costs more than $10,000. These are not just the ones that your neighbor probably has to take pictures.
You've kind of gotten at the pros of this technology. Drones can be faster than humans can run. They got that kind of bird's eye view, so they can be helpful for that. Is that generally the extent of the pros of this technology, is that, you can search a wide area quickly? Exactly.
They can search a wide area or get down to a low, again, the drone. If they can fly it the same height a person can, they're not as useful there, for example. We can have, a person can walk down the street. But those very literal bird's eye views are, even the critics I've spoken to are like this. There is very beneficial uses of this technology. If I had a loved one who gets swept out to sea, it would be awesome that a drone could go find them and they could get a boat to them sooner. The concerns are largely based on the Fourth Amendment, which is based on a reasonable search and seizure, especially reasonable search. And that's where I think there's some very interesting legal questions come in and some very important ethical questions that come in of what do we want to see from our government, what do we not want to see from our government? Because both our state and national governments have not passed a bunch of legislation regarding law enforcement use of drones yet, other than saying you can use them, don't break the law.
So this is a relatively new technology, first used around 2013, and as recently as 2020, only 6 years ago, there were less than 100 drones used by local police jurisdictions throughout the country. Now we mentioned Milwaukee itself is using 12 of them. So relatively new technology. What has that discourse between those critics that you mentioned bringing up issues with the Fourth Amendment rights, privacy, protester rights, and someone who says like, hey, this technology is helpful in police work generally?
So the governing Supreme Court decision that kind of defines how drones and also like helicopters can be used by law enforcement is called Florida v. Riley. It was came in 1989, in which a helicopter was used to identify an illegal marijuana grow operation, and the defendant in the case said, "They flew over my property, but that's my property. It was a legal search. They shouldn't be able to admit that as evidence." And the Supreme Court found that no, that is legal because since they were not, that nobody has a reasonable right to privacy. For example, you can't stop a plane from flying over your house. And thus, you can't stop a helicopter from flying over your house. Now, the question therein is that if a law enforcement officer is flying a drone over your house and they see something that they weren't looking for, what is considered, it could something be used evidence against you, or also just a privacy concern. And one of the officers I spoke with said, "We don't care what you're doing in your house in your underwear." And that, I think for most officers, that would make sense. The concerns are when it is misused. For example, when the Wisconsin legislature in 2013 passed its first law on law enforcement drones, they basically just said drones can be used by law enforcement for illegal operations. They cannot be used for illegal search, which would have basically been covered anyways, but it was basically just giving law enforcement green light, like, hey, go use this technology. It's okay. And there hasn't been any follow-up, and there isn't really any impetus right now. The Wisconsin ACLU is trying to pressure municipalities, for example, the city of Milwaukee, to put up some parameters to say, here's when drones can and cannot be used. The Milwaukee Police Department, for their part, they're the tracker online that shows every flight they've been on. You can look at them. I thought it'd be more interesting than it ended up being, but really it's just a bunch of lines over Milwaukee. But it is still that there is transparency there, but a lot of it is not codified in law. It is just what has been done. And a lot of the critics are saying, we don't want to ban this technology, but we want to have more guardrails on that, especially regarding evidence. How long is it kept for? What can be done with the videos in the next year or 10 years or 100 years?
So it sounds like legally drones are, you can think of them as extension of the police officer, right?
Very much
so. You can't
so.
fly a drone inside someone's home, but you could fly a drone over someone's home, see what they're kind of doing in the
same way, a law enforcement officer can walk down the street, a drone could be flown down the street. And that's kind of for example, a helicopter could be flown over your house, a drone could be flown over your house. And so the laws defining where a drone can go are basically anywhere a police officer can go, which is to say an officer can drive down your street, look. If you got your curtains open, they can technically look into your house and see what's going on. But at the same time, they can't fly a drone into your house unless there is, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but a reasonable belief that a crime might be committed. Drones, for example, if somebody is kidnapped somebody, kept them in their house, or there's a standoff with police, drones have been flown into houses, and drones have also been shot by people inside their homes because the drone got into an open window. So that's kind of where the uses are. But like I said, there aren't really laws defining this beyond what a police officer can and cannot do. And in that kind of situation, a police officer could, if somebody is holed up in their home, a police officer could breach a door or go in through a window. But that's a very dangerous situation for everybody because now, for example, the drone could get shot. A drone got shot. That's a few $1,000s out the window as opposed to a human being getting hurt, which nobody wants.
You're listening to 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I am Lake Effect Sam Wood speaking with Adam Rogan, who wrote a piece in this month's Milwaukee Magazine about police drones. And Adam, we've gone over an overview of what police drones are, their pros, their cons, but I want to get into facial recognition technology, also a new technology, also kind of have similar privacy concerns. Have you seen any evidence that these two technologies have linked, that we'll say in Milwaukee that police drones have been used and then the video that they capture is used in a facial recognition technology database?
So locally, I haven't seen any evidence of that, but that doesn't mean that couldn't happen. For example, I spoke with John McCraig Jones, who works at the Wisconsin ACLU, and what he had told me was, what if J. Edgar Hoover could have used facial recognition technology during the Selma March? Which is a chilling thought, knowing the FBI is not always a rosy history of civil rights. And one thing that we've seen with the Trump administration has really tried to break down these walls between local and national law enforcement and departments to allow the federal government to have more access to local information. It's, I think, another interesting question legally, but the concerns of, for example, ICE has pretty much been open that there are databases of protesters, or what they're calling agitators. And we've seen this, including in 2020 during protests here in the Milwaukee area, of known protesters being kept in a database. And so there's a very strong concern about the chilling effect that this facial recognition technology applied to ample drone footage and police camera footage could have on legal protesting, and also privacy concerns there. I also spoke with Paul Bucher, who's a former Waukesha County district attorney. And when I brought up that concern, he kind of laughed, because his take was, every police car already has multiple cameras on it, or at least most of them do. A lot of police officers have body cameras. There's cameras on the city. A lot of times businesses and other organizations will share their security footage if something happens with law enforcement upon request. And so the drones aren't actually anything new. They're just another type of camera. There are not drones, to my knowledge, flying above our city 24/7. And so it's another interesting take of drones are another question we have to wrestle with as Americans dealing with the Fourth Amendment. But they are, in the sense, just a different way of applying a camera, which have been around for however long. Now with the facial recognition is new, but also we have every police officer has a camera on his chest.
So when it comes to regulation and policy around this, what kind of discussions are happening either in Wisconsin or elsewhere about how we kind of thread that needle between, recognizing that there can be uses for this technology, but also respecting privacy and individual rights?
So one of the big takeaways I had, at least from my reporting this, is that there aren't a lot of conversations happening on legislative levels about to deal with this. And part of that is, especially with the, let's call, uncertainty in the current federal government, changes being implemented by the Trump administration, it's not a priority for anybody. There's on the federal level, there's bigger fish to fry, and on a state level, there's significant fish to fry, and also a Democratic governor with a Republican legislature. It's not their priority, and so that's where, for example, the ACLU is trying to push cities and counties to implement laws of their own, especially in large municipalities like Milwaukee, like Madison, which are more likely to have access to this kind of technology, to have oversight boards or other ways of just, if nothing else, keeping an eye on what the police are doing and letting the public know. And there have been some conversation about that at the local level, but to an extent, it's largely been police department is sharing X amount of information. The Police Fire Commission has asked some questions, but largely it's gone unregulated. I shouldn't say unregulated, but regulated by the same laws that govern police otherwise. And those who want stronger oversight have said we need to have specific rules about when drones can and cannot be used, as opposed to when an officer feels that it is appropriate.
Yeah, it sounds like right now here in Milwaukee, there's kind of it's regulated by voluntary transparency. Earlier, you mentioned the Milwaukee Police Department has a tracker online. You can see where drones have been flown. But I imagine there, some people hear that and say, that might be nice, but we would love to have something a little bit more that you can't just take away. So with all this in mind, we covered a lot of ground here. In summation, Milwaukee Police Department employs 12 drones, cost about $10,000 each. Can be helpful in cases where we need to search for someone and time is of the essence. So someone is drowning in a lake or there's a shooting victim that needs help immediately. But concerns with privacy, Fourth Amendment rights, protester rights, and possible use with facial recognition technology in the future. All of this being relatively low on state and federal governments' priority lists to regulate. So All that being said, Adam, big question here. What's the future for this technology?
Drones have been around for a while. They're incredibly cool technology in the same way that airplanes are super cool. They're going to stay around. And so now the question is, and I think we're going to see this a lot of change in the next 10 years, especially if, for example, there are high-profile cases where, for example, that Florida case from the 80s is very interesting. It's one of those where, we've never tackled this question before. And so there will be at some point evidence challenged in a case where somebody said this drone use was illegal. The prosecutors can say no, it's completely legal, and we're going to have a new question. It's probably going to end up at the Supreme Court level. I very much expect me to be here maybe in 2-3 years doing a follow-up of the Wisconsin Supreme Court is considering so-and-so because X and Y happened and it was recorded with a drone. And we're going to find out what happens there. I'm not a legal expert by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just here to tell you what's going on and what happened.
Well, I don't want to say I can't wait for that day, but if that day does come, we'll give you a shout.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Sam.
That was freelance journalist Adam Rogan. You can find his piece about police drones in this month's issue of Milwaukee Magazine. He spoke with Lake Effect's Sam Woods. Today, it's so easy to quickly look up any kind of recipe online. But before the internet, people frequently called Milwaukee Public Library's Ready Reference to get help finding recipes. Librarians clipped recipes from the Milwaukee Journal over the course of 20 years. Today, it's a digitized collection called the Historic Recipe File, a searchable database that holds over 5,400 recipes. So, if you're interested in recreating State Fair cream puffs at home or want to make cabbage crust spinach pie, well, the recipe file is a great place to look. Library Services Manager Christina Gomez joins me now to share more. Christina Gomez, welcome to Lake Effect. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
Great, thanks for having me.
So what is the Historic Recipe File and how was this compiled?
Yeah, so the Historic Recipe File is actually a collection of hundreds of recipes that were clipped between 1960 and 1980 by librarians at Milwaukee Public Library, and they clipped these recipes directly from the Milwaukee Journal and the Milwaukee Sentinel. We would get lots of calls here at the library, people asking for these recipes, before the internet. So we decided to collect all of these so that we could share with people via phone.
As you mentioned, it's one of the things we take for granted on the internet is instant, access, and you can look up information, recipes. But thinking about a librarian double checking a newspaper clipping for someone is really endearing to me, like at the Ready Reference desk, ready to answer recipe questions.
Yeah, and they were super popular. We've always had cookbooks, but folks were really into the recipes that were published in our daily papers here in Milwaukee. And a lot of them actually were recipes from local restaurants, things that had relevance to our region. Actually, one of my favorites is there was a recipe for the State Fair cream puffs. So that was a really popular one as well if you wanted to try and make your own if you couldn't get to the State Fair. So.
As you mentioned, the collection of these recipes offers a glimpse into the foods that were popular in Milwaukee decades ago. What stands out to you about the variety of recipes? I know there's thousands, right? And I assume most have mayo in them, but some are pretty standard. But yeah, what does it kind of tell about what people were looking forward to in the papers?
Yeah, well, like you mentioned, thousands, right? So we have actually over 5,000 recipes in the collection. What stands out to me is the wide range of international options. I think that surprised me a bit, to be honest. We, of course, have recipes from, German foods, Polish foods, but also West African. I saw a recipe for fufu in there, a ton from Eastern Europe, as well as Latin America. So that's always really fun to browse through. So many with gelatin. I think that along with the mayo, it's kind of like, okay, what were we doing with gelatin at this time? Lots of meats in Jell-O and things like that. So blast from the past for sure. And yeah, another that stood out to me is the wide range of vegetarian options. That was a bit surprising. I don't necessarily think of that when I think of those decades. When I was looking through, actually my niece is vegetarian, so I was kind of looking through it, and what kind of stood out to me, there was one for dandelion omelet. And I was like, okay, that would be interesting. Maybe if you're into foraging and you grab some dandelions, that could be a fun recipe to explore.
And I also really like that some of the recipes were featured from restaurants that are no longer here
Yeah.
because I think food memory is such a big component of who we are and the cultures we grow up in.
Yeah, it's a part of our history, right? Like our shared history of our city. So I think in that way, it's also a really great glimpse into Milwaukee, like what our community members back then were eating when they went out and what they enjoyed to make at home.
Now, you mentioned a couple recipes. Have you tried making any of them? Do others stand out because they're simply ones you would never try because of the ingredients?
Yeah, there was one with some interesting kind of like game meats, which I'm not super into, like rabbit and other things like that. But I have made one. I actually made albondigas, which are just Spanish meatballs, and it was delicious. It was very simple to make. I cut back on the lard a bit because that's also an ingredient that appears in lots of these recipes. But it was really good. It was easy to make, easy to find. So I appreciated that.
Yeah. You mentioned over 5,000 recipes. Is this collection continuing to grow?
It's not. So the librarian stopped clipping the recipes from the paper probably about in the 80s. So right now, that size is what it is, but luckily it's all digitized. So anyone can access it online and you can search by either like a regional cuisine. So if you wanted to, kind of look up what Polish recipes we have, you could find it that way. You could also just search by ingredient. So if you have certain ingredients in your pantry and you want to figure out how to make it, you could also search the collection that way.
And I like the scan digitization of these recipes because it is, in a way, like looking at an old recipe card, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So you can see actually the handwriting of the librarians at the time. Sometimes they wrote little notes right on the recipes themselves. So that's very cool to look at.
I love it. Well, definitely a lot to explore here, and I might try my hand at one of these recipes. So, Christina,
yes,
thank you so much for sharing more about the historic recipe file.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Christina Gomez is the Library Services Manager at Milwaukee Public Library. At WUWM.com, you can find a link to the recipe collection and explore our Books and Beyond conversations. We'll take one more break, and when we come back, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of Bubbler Talk with a special Best of season. But we're not just bringing back our old reporting, we're also going to tell you how it was done. That's next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM.
WUWM is celebrating 10 years of Bubbler Talk. Can you believe it? 10 years. What have you always wanted to know about the Milwaukee area's people, places, or culture? Thousands of people have responded to that prompt with their own questions, helping us report out hundreds of really great stories. I'm Michelle Maternowski, WUWM's Audience Innovation Manager. You might be wondering, who the heck are you, and why are you hosting this? Well, I like to think of myself as the mother of Bubbler Talk. I helped get Bubbler Talk off the ground in 2016, introducing the idea of engagement journalism to our team. And we thought it would be fun to celebrate Bubbler Talk's 10th anniversary by doing something a little bit different this season. For the podcast, we're listening back to some of our favorite episodes, and I'm chatting with the WWM reporters and producers who created them. It's fitting that we start with Bubbler Talk's very first episode. Why do Wisconsinites call that a bubbler anyway? It aired April 22nd, 2016, and it was produced by the one and only Lake Effect host and producer, Joy Powers. Hey, Joy.
Hi.
I'm excited to be celebrating Bubbler Talk's anniversary with you.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
So I have a really hard-hitting first question.
Great.
Do you call a bubbler a bubbler? It's not funny.
Do I? I mean, not really. I'm from an area of the state, so I'm from Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Which, if anyone is familiar with Lake Geneva, yeah, I can see by your face you're not.
No.
It's kind of a mix of an area.
Yeah, you got some Chicago in there.
A lot of Chicago in there. So we would call it everything.
Everything?
Everyone
you
would
go drink out of the everything?
Water fountain, drinking fountain, bubbler. If you asked for any of these, people would point you in the right direction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there goes all my follow-up questions. I'm kidding. Okay, so we are going to go listen to this very first episode recorded 10 years ago, and then we can chat about it a little bit afterwards.
Bubbler Talk, quenching Milwaukee's thirst for knowledge.
I'm Joy Powers. I'm one of the producers for Lake Effect, and this is our question asker.
I'm Katie Now from Shorewood, Wisconsin.
Katie just moved here from Chicago, and when her daughter came home from school one day, Katie noticed she'd picked up a new 7-letter word for a pretty familiar item. So she wondered,
why does everyone around here call that a bubbler?
It's a question a lot of Wisconsinites don't know the answer to, and those who think they know have often fallen prey to the myth of Harlan Huckleby. As the story goes, a Kohler employee named
Harlan Huckleby. I designed the bubbler in 1888 while working for Kohler Waterworks, which trademarked the name.
The problem with that story?
When you started digging around, I couldn't find any evidence of Mr. Huckleby. I couldn't find any evidence of the Kohler Waterworks. I think that was the first thing that tipped me off.
That's Beth Dipple, the executive director for the Sheboygan County Historical Research Center. It's near Kohler, Wisconsin. She researched the origin story, and not only did she find there wasn't a Harlan Huckleby, there wasn't even a Kohler Waterworks.
Kohler really didn't exist at that time. Kohler was part of Kohler, Hyson, and Stein, downtown in Sheboygan in the city, but they weren't making anything like bubblers. They weren't making plumbing products like Kohler is now. So you start to map this whole thing out, and you find there are really a number of flaws to that story. But the curious thing is it is everywhere. If you go on the internet and do any kind of research with bubbler, that just comes up automatically.
So where did Harlan Huckleby come from?
I have no idea. You never know how these things get started. I know how they get, shoved along.
But even without Harlan Huckleby, Dipple still has a theory on where the term bubbler came from.
This I got from some of my researchers who attended one-room schools. State of Wisconsin, there were thousands of them every couple of miles or so.
And many of them featured a new bit of technology, a water container made by the Red Wing Company. Although the modern Red Wing Company is known for its boots, in the 1800s it was a bit more concerned with pottery. The water containers were pretty similar to modern water coolers.
But there was also an attachment that you could lean over just like we do with bubblers now, and then they called that the bubbler. And I'm thinking that's where that came from.
Do we know why they called these water coolers bubblers?
Yeah, I think it's just because the water did bubble up. It sort of made a little burp.
So as far as the origins go of the word bubbler, it's still kind of a mystery, right?
Yes, we don't know. I'm sure there was no Harlan Huckleby. Kohler did not initiate it. This is the way a lot of this stuff starts. A couple of inventions here or there. Somebody takes an invention, they tweak it, and then we add our own local twist to it.
It's crazy because, bubbler is not that old a term, and yet figuring out its origins are so difficult.
Well, and some of this stuff is day-to-day history, too. You know when you're in the middle of something big, and people start to document things right away. But because that stuff develops slowly over a period of time, and maybe even over 2 or 3 or 4 years, nobody ever sits down and writes out, oh, this is how this started. This is where we got the name. This is how those things just get lost in time. It's the stuff that nobody ever writes down. That's what you want to know about.
So back to our question asker, Katie.
So we don't really know.
So we don't really know. How do you feel about that?
It's a lot of interesting information. Still kind of wonder. It's interesting to me that just a few miles away in Chicago, we call it a water fountain, and up here it's a bubbler.
Way to report on such a controversial first episode.
I have to tell you, I feel like I've reported on much more controversial things, and this has gotten the most comments and the most emails and the most everything. This is the most controversial piece I ever
Yeah, people
did.
were not satisfied that we don't really know. I remember we were getting theories of what it was. Unexpected to have such feedback, but we love our bubbler.
And a lot of people are really stuck on the relationship to a modern day drinking fountain, which I can appreciate. But when I talked to Beth Dipple, and when I've done other research outside of that, the first appearance of this word in reference to like a public drinking fountain predates Kohler as a plumbing company. So the idea that Kohler is the reason why we call it a bubbler, it's just not plausible. The other issue, though, is that like this is an everyday history kind of thing. So Kohler does end up making a device that's a drinking fountain, that a design that they call the bubbler.
Oh, they actually call it the bubbler?
Yeah,
Okay.
that they call a bubbler. And so it's a little hard to say, well, Kohler might be the reason this term proliferated. That could be. But the origins of that word are certainly not with Kohler.
Yeah. People might not know, but you actually designed the logo that we use for Bubbler Talk.
That is accurate.
That is accurate.
I did do that. At the time, I was making a lot more art. I still do a bit of that, but I believe it was Mitch and Christine walked up to my desk and they said, "Hey, you do art, right?" And I went, "Yeah, I guess." They're like, "Well, will you design a logo?" At the time, like, we didn't have money for logos.
We didn't even have logos.
No. We didn't. Like, the Lake Effect logo at the time was a typeface. Like, that's what it was.
Okay, so logo aside, you've done a lot more when it comes to Bubbler Talk than this very first story and design the logo. Do you have a favorite episode that you've done?
A favorite episode? It's so hard to remember 10 years of work, especially when you do so much other stuff.
Yeah.
I did like the last piece I did.
Can you explain that one?
So the last piece I did was about what seems like a relatively simple question. Where are the victims of the Bayview Massacre buried, right? The Bayview Massacre, or Bayview tragedy, depending on who you're talking to, is an event that happens in the late 1800s. It's a labor dispute. It's part of a larger movement called the 48 movement, which was looking for better working conditions for laborers. It was really centered in Milwaukee and Chicago. And what happens in Milwaukee is a number of laborers march toward the Bayview rolling mill to protest it. They are gunned down by state militia who had been sent there by the governor. It's a really seminal moment in Milwaukee history, in part because it launches the People's Party, which turns into the Socialist Party here in the city, and really changes the next century of politics in the city of Milwaukee. And yet, there are very few markers dedicated to these people who died. There is a marker on the former site of the Bayview rolling mill. But part of the issue is that a lot of these people were relatively new immigrants. And once they came to the United States, a lot of them started to go by more Americanized names. So even knowing who was actually killed was difficult. But you can find them, and you can try to figure it out. And so, like, this story was essentially figuring out who actually died. Who were the actual victims?
Which is crazy that we don't know that. And it took a person submitting a question to, like, get to the bottom of it. It's amazing how that comes together. Yeah.
It's wild. You don't realize how much time it takes to figure out that someone didn't exist. So, like, essentially it was a game of telephone with these names. There were certain names that have continued.
And some people were called different names in
different publications, because some people would know this guy as John. Other people would know him as Johann. And John and Johann, after more than 100 years, can become two separate people. Yeah. And that's what happened with the case of Johann Zaska. Johann Zaska does not exist. It's John Maschke. Johann Zaska and John Marsh were two victims that were denoted. They're actually just one man. They're John Maschke or Johann Maschke.
Would you say that was the hardest story to report?
Maybe. It took a lot of research. I will say the people at the Milwaukee Public Library are incredibly helpful. If you tell them that you have a weird mystery that you're trying to solve, you'll get a lot of librarians
hovering around you.
going, it does seem like we need to solve this. It involved a lot of...
You kind of make them sound like superheroes.
They're great. I will say, the moment I would hit a dead end, they'd be like, well, have you looked at the church's historic book? And, they'd lead me over there.
Yeah, it's so interesting how many people are like behind the scenes trying to help you pull this story together. We also get a lot of questions that are very personal, like people wanting to know about their own family history. And I think we kind of get those and we're like, what am I supposed to do with this? But we got a question from Brian Mikeworth, and that was in a similar vein. And he wanted to know about the history of the property that he owns. And you took a really interesting approach with that one. Can you talk about that story? And then, what was it like including him in your reporting?
Oh, sure.
Do you remember what I'm talking about?
I do.
Okay,
yes,
good.
This is, I think, I can't even remember the name of the piece, but it was about historic home research.
It was like how to look up historic properties or the history of a property.
I can't remember the name of the building, but it's over on Broadway. You can find the original kind of deed to your home sometimes. You can find sometimes layouts. You can also find just records of the property. So if they added something to the house, if they made any major changes that would have required them going to the city for permission, they'll have that information.
Is it like a room just filled with filing cabinets? Like a dark room, just like
it's very
walls?
DMV.
Okay.
So
that's not as exciting as what I'm picturing.
It's very DMV, but here's kind of the setup. You walk in, you say why you're there. They go, great. They take you to the person.
They say, next.
Basically. They take you to the person who you need to talk to. They say, okay, what's the address? What's the current address? And you give it to them. They go through kind of a file. They find the microfiche because it is on microfiche. That's where you can get a lot of property owner names, which can be very helpful. So his home was in Town of Lake.
Mm-hmm.
The borders changed a lot. Town of Lake also, as you may know, notoriously not a part of the city until relatively recently. That happens under the Zeidler administration, I believe, as he's expanding the borders of the city of Milwaukee to try to incorporate the ever-growing suburbs in a way and stop that growth. He was unsuccessful in doing that. But because of that, it complicates the records. And so I went to the library. I asked, what can we do here? Again, very helpful. We sat down with plat maps, and we just kind of went block for block to find this. Yeah.
I think it was what I remember about the story is just that the approach that you took and that it could expand it to it's almost like a guide for anyone who wants to do this because it sounds so complicated. When you're explaining it right now, I went over to this room, I got this, and then I got this map. But it's I liked how you kind of laid it out of if you're interested in learning this for your own, home, there's a way to do it. And these resources that are available to you as a reporter are also available to you as the person.
We gave a step-by-step guide, I will say.
Yes,
so it's
that
not
was very helpful. So
nearly as complicated.
We can link to that in the show notes. But if you could submit a question to Bubbler Talk, what would that question be?
What would that question be?
Or do you feel like you can just do that in your day-to-day work? You have a question, that is your job of booking interviews.
If I have a question, I try to answer it.
Yeah.
One of the things I really enjoy about our work is that it feeds that kind of curiosity that all of us have, and it gives us the tools to investigate that. You have a question, and sometimes you think this is unanswerable. How would I ever? And yet, if you just scratch a little bit and you go, well, what are the ways that I can answer this? What are the things around this question that I can get a little bit of insight into? And if you keep scratching and scratching and scratching, eventually you're going to find that full story.
Yeah, you just need time and curiosity.
You need time. That's the biggest resource in this job.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Joy, so much for talking for this 10th anniversary of Bubbler Talk. And I want to thank the listeners, because they're the ones who've really made this series. Like, you did an okay job, but it's the listeners and their questions that have fed this whole thing. And they've been amazing questions that have led you on these like crazy adventures to go uncover them. And we're always looking for more questions. So go to wuwm.com/bubblertalk, and that's where you can submit questions that maybe you can go with Joy into some weird dark library room and uncover a mystery. So thank you. Subscribe to the Bubbler Talk podcast. We'll keep listening to some of our favorite episodes for the series' 10th anniversary.
That conversation celebrating 10 years of Bubbler Talk wraps up today's show. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. If you've missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at wuwm.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll bring you some of the top stories from this week, including a conversation with a local farmer about how the war in Iran is affecting his bottom line. Thank you so much for joining us today, right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.